Clash possession movie. That's what's on the table for today's video. We are talking Shaman, directed by Antonio Negret. And this is a movie that focuses on this kind of missionary family that is trying to teach the kind of the indigenous people of this Ecuadorian village about the church. So they've set up this missionary practice, and they are helping the people, you know, teaching them English, kind of giving them medical advice and things like this. And they is a couple, and they have like a young teenage son. And one day this teenage son is kind of messing around, and he ends up kind of going in this cave and is possessed by this kind of spirit or kind of entity. And, you know, obviously it kind of follows that sort of possession route. The interesting thing here being that this is not a typical kind of demonic force, which is normally the Catholic Church would deal with in a way, because this comes from a different culture. That normal stuff just ain't working in this situation. And now we have this this couple who are stuck out in the middle of rural Ecuador, trying to figure out how to help their son, who is possessed by this kind of, you know, spirit or entity which is specific to this kind of culture. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So the Catholic Church ain't going to help you with this one, basically. Let's talk about what works in this movie's favour. Now, admittedly, this does play out like a relatively typical possession movie in some ways. But its biggest sort of feather in its cap, I suppose, is the fact that this is not like a demon possession movie where we've seen that type of demon which is typically dealt with by the church, the Catholic Church and stuff. This is some type of entity from a different culture, and it almost is offended that these missionaries are here. So when this boy is possessed, the church, the kind of the practices that you would normally see in an exorcism simply don't work, because this entity doesn't recognise the Catholic Church or God, as you know, those of us in the West would know it, as a legitimate type of entity in itself, and is almost just like more offended that they're on his land, so to speak. Which I think this movie gives this movie, at least in this respect, a interesting and unique angle on an exorcism film. So, you know, and then you add to that this couple is in this area which is very remote. They really can't call anyone for help, and are really only having to rely on these kind of local people and the kind of like the kind of things that they have to hand. And the local people are seeing now this kind of this pressure that these missionaries are on, and are kind of, you know, is this now turning them to turn away from God? So I do think there are some interesting kind of theological elements to this movie, and in a way it's somewhat critical of religion. It's almost like saying that the church is hypocritical in some ways, because these are people that have come into this kind of, you know, indigenous community, trying to convert them into you know, the ways of the church, and trying to, you know, teach them this way, but they're unwilling to kind of listen about their own culture, these indigenous people's culture. And when this kind of entity is clearly, you know, not a biblical you know, entity in any way, it's they have a trouble kind of like accepting that maybe this culture should be listened to. So there's a little bit of commentary on the hypocritical nature, necessarily, of maybe what people in the West would consider their religion and things like that. It doesn't really bang over the head with it, but you know, there is that little bit of an interesting kind of dynamic. I will say I think this movie in some ways feels sort of quite authentic. It's our main characters are all English speaking, but they do communicate with the locals for the most part in like Spanish, and you know, I think they did a great job of casting these kind of like local actors who really do look, you know, very authentic and kind of seem very much like this kind of indigenous, you know, Ecuadorian kind of tribe or people who live by very kind of sparse means and stuff. I thought that kind of gives it this, you know, somewhat of an authentic feel for where it's supposed to be sort of taking place, and the kind of the obviously the location shooting here really kind of helps that as well. So in some aspects I think this movie offers you something maybe that you haven't seen before. In other ways it very much is what you are expecting of a possession movie. So you'll have that mix of the new and familiar. Because the story is very much like a possession movie, even though it has this sort of, you know, outer layer of aesthetic which is kind of different. So if you were a fan of like the possession style movies and you just want to kind of watch, you know, you're a big fan of these things and you want to watch another one, here's another one for you, but with a kind of a fresh, you know, coat of paint really, I suppose. I do think the movie's quite well shot, and you know, giving you this kind of feeling of isolation on top of everything else makes it for sort of quite a desperate time. And this sort of kind of kid, there are some pretty decent sequences where he's being affected by this kind of entity, and he looks very sort of, you know, uncomfortable and you know, supernatural at times. So, you know, I do think this movie is at the very least a pretty watchable film in regards to that, as long as you're not expecting at least anything plot-wise too different. Because as you go into the negatives, even though I think this movie has an element of uniqueness, it ultimately follows a somewhat predictable path in regards to its narrative. So I think it's not as unique as it could have been, and I think it ultimately, as I say, it has elements that you haven't seen before, but it ends up being maybe a little bit too generic in its in the way that it kind of tells a story. You know, at the end of the day, so you know, it may be a little bit of a wasted opportunity, you might say. VFX wise, I think there are some images where this movie comes out pretty strong, but at the same time, its use of kind of CGI elements here makes it kind of look somewhat unfinished in some respects. The CGI never really looks particularly strong, and you know, there's a little bit kind of face manipulation, kind of CGI scorpions and stuff, and it doesn't look brilliant. And I think sometimes when you juxtapose that with some of the great kind of cinematography and, you know, location shooting here, it's a shame, because the movie feels quite sort of like well shot in many ways, but they're kind of these not quite up to scratch sort of CGI effects, you know, unfortunately undo some of that, I think, good work that is done on some of the other elements here. Maybe this movie's biggest sin, outside of being a little unoriginal, I suppose, is I think the movie almost feels like it's like a bit of a cheat in regards to the scares. This is a film which is very kind of guilty of having like these big jump scares coupled with like big loud noises to kind of like make you go ah, and there's plenty of times where something's going to jump out at you and it's followed by like a loud kind of crashing sound and then silence. And you know, it does it a little bit too much, whether to the point where it's sort of noticeable. And I think people you either love jump scares or you don't. I mean, I don't mind them necessarily, but even I have to say, felt like this movie was overdoing it to a degree, and what it didn't do was really have this kind of like spooky atmosphere that was built on a feeling of dread and kind of eeriness. Instead, it kind of had these, you know, these quieter moments, then punctuated by a jump scare and like a loud noise, and then kind of quiet again to make you. And that's where kind of that's your scares basically. You couple that with the kind of the lackluster kind of CGI and ultimately generic narrative. You know, ultimately it doesn't kind of quite land in some respects. Now, how to sort of summarise this movie? It's not a bad film, I don't think, and I feel you could arguably say this movie is quite middle of the road. I do think the element here of having a sort of people who are devout sort of Catholics having to deal with a possession that is not a a Bible related kind of or demonic related exorcism or possession, and how that sort of flummoxes them is an interesting idea, and I will give it maybe a little bit of extra credit for that. I don't think it does quite as much with it as it could have done. So ultimately it's a sort of serviceable but unremarkable possession movie, just with a kind of an interesting veneer of paint and sort of a little bit of a different culture to it, but doesn't go quite far enough. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. So, you know, arguably somewhat of an average movie, but just with some kind of bells and whistles that gives it a little bit of its own identity. So overall making it a slightly above average film for me. 6 out of 10. What are your thoughts if you've seen it? Let me know and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.